Thank you very much, John, for your very kind introduction, and good morning to all of you. It's good to be back. I have been asked today to comment on realities and challenges for the United States and for Latin America and the Caribbean. And to tell you the truth, I am very optimistic for a number of different reasons. The last 5 years have been good for the region. Commodity prices have been high and rising. GDP has grown throughout the region, and in some cases, the rise has been spectacular. Of course, what countries do with their prosperity is crucial, and we'll get into that. Some are reducing poverty among their citizens. According to the UN Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, ECLAC, Brazil, Chile, Ecuador, Mexico, and Venezuela have achieved impressive results in reducing poverty over the last 5 years. Others, like Argentina, despite GDP growth rates of over 8% during this period, have poverty rates still at the high 1990 levels. Brazil and Argentina have paid their debts to the IMF, and I believe that in January, Brazil finally became, after years of being a debtor nation, is now finally a creditor nation. Argentina, however, must now reschedule or repay more than $6 billion in defaulted debt to Paris Club members. And finally, Brazil, Chile, and Venezuela are also using some of their increased earnings to buy expensive military weapons systems. Most countries in the region are market-oriented, democratically inclined, follow good macroeconomic policies, and seek to insert themselves into a globalized economy. Please note, however, that the market-oriented democracies include Brazil, Peru, Uruguay, and Chile, all of which are governed by left-of-center presidents. They agree on market economics, a reduced role for the state, trade expanding agreements, and keeping inflation low. But they also differ in many ways, including the degree of emphasis on social policies, the rule of law, as well as antitrust and competition policy. A few governments, such as Bolivia, Ecuador, and Venezuela, reject globalization. They do not follow good macroeconomic policies and seek to strengthen the president's role as well as state control of the economy. Inflation has risen to around 20% in Argentina and Venezuela, even though both governments vigorously deny that figure. And finally, although public opinion is not very high on democracy in the region, the fact is that recent polls indicate that more and more in the region, people are tending to believe that you cannot achieve growth without having a market economy. And for me, that's music to my ears. I hope it's true, but that's what the polls say, and I'm delighted. Now, today, the media talk a lot about U.S.-Latin American relations in negative terms. There is no doubt that the invasion of Iraq deeply disturbed Latin Americans because it demonstrated that the United States was quite prepared to use force unilaterally. And as you know, from the very beginning of the independent Western Hemisphere, the concern about how the United States would use its force has always been there. It's not been a frontline issue, but you can search through the literature. Many people have expressed concern about it, including people like Simón Bolívar and José Martí. Even though the Cold War ended almost 2 decades ago, the outdated perceptions of that struggle continue to shape areas of U.S. foreign policy, particularly our relations with Latin America and Caribbean countries. U.S. interests have changed. Therefore, the United States must apply new strategies to achieve its new goals. The United States should use an increasingly hands-off approach as Latin American countries assert themselves more strongly in the world arena. By the same token, the U.S. must be prepared to promote democracy, good governance, and open markets in order to strengthen the region's competitiveness in a globalized world. These are crucial to the future of Latin America and the Caribbean. The United States should not fret about, quote, declining, unquote, influence in the region, but adjust to the reality that Latin American countries deserve respect in managing their own country's affairs as we help them integrate, as I said earlier, into a global economy. We must understand that most of the region's problems can only be addressed successfully by the governments of the Caribbean and Latin America themselves. Once these governments recognize the need for change and take responsibility for it, the United States should be prepared to support their efforts. And here, just a word about the left in Latin America. You know, the left in Latin America, like every country in Latin America, has developed somewhat differently. And there never has been sort of an overarching definition by the left in Latin America about where they're going or what they stand for. And that's still the case. I've already pointed out that some of the countries that are governed by left-of-center governments, in fact, to a very large measure, see the world the way we do. They are going to continue developing at their own pace, in their own way. We have to be patient. It's not going to happen in 5 years. I've got to tell you, when I first began in the Foreign Service, I thought, well, no, by the time I'm retired, everything's going to be great. And here I am thinking, well, maybe in a couple of generations. But the fact is that the countries are going to develop at their own rate, and we just have to learn to be patient. And they will get where they're going, and we just have to keep our shirt on. The end of the Cold War is significant not only because communism fell in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. The emergence of the post-Cold War world also brought about a change of U.S. strategic interests in Latin America. For more than 4 decades, between the end of World War II and the demise of the Soviet Union, U.S. policy in the region was part of a grander Cold War strategy. Strategy and actions were examined and carried out in the light of the greater goal of containing and eventually defeating communism. With the disappearance of the Soviet Union, however, U.S. interests in the region have shifted from resisting communism to promoting growth, stability, and democracy. In addition, I don't need to remind you that the U.S. has other global priorities to which it must devote a lot of attention and resources. Let me give you one example of looking backward rather than forward that sort of typifies this Cold War mentality that you still hear in Washington. Several countries in the region, as I said earlier, are governed by left-of-center governments, but by and large, in terms of the way they look at economics and the global world, view things the way we do. The administration has said repeatedly that it wants to have good working relations with countries either on the left or on the right. And yet, some commentators and some think tanks, particularly in the Washington area, continue to interpret the presence of left-of-center governments in the region to mean that the U.S. has lost influence. Another form of backward thinking is based on the false assumption that regional dependence on the United States is so great that whatever goes wrong in Latin America and the Caribbean is due to a failure on the part of the U.S. And this is usually coupled to an equally false corollary, that is, that the U.S. can fix whatever's gone wrong in the region. U.S. military policy toward Latin America still contains components that are Cold War relics. During the Cold War, the United States helped Latin American nations confront leftist insurgencies through closer military ties and assistance programs, like the Alliance for Progress, for example. Later, in the 1980s, something that Ambassador Quayton will remember very well, interest focused on Central America out of fear that Nicaragua would become a second Cuba on the mainland. The United States developed strong military ties with the region following World War II. Most weapon systems were either purchased from the United States or obtained from excess American stocks. The United States provided the model for training and doctrine and developed a tutelary role, which included deciding which weapon systems could be transferred into the region to maintain regional stability. Nowadays, when a Latin American country wants to modernize its weapon systems, Western European countries and former members of the Soviet Union regularly compete with US suppliers. The sophistication, complexity, and cost of US weapon systems exceed the needs and resources of most Latin American nations. The United States, for example, no longer produces nuclear submarines, thus opening possibilities for a number of countries in Western Europe that produce non-nuclear submarines. And as I mentioned earlier, Brazil, Chile, and Venezuela are modernizing some weapon systems. Chile is buying F-15 aircraft from the US. Brazil is shopping for aircraft and even for a nuclear submarine from France. And Venezuela is buying helicopters and other aircraft from Russia and is considering buying more from Belarus and China. This is not the first time that Latin American countries have bought weapons in Europe or from the former Soviet Union. Peru, Brazil, and Venezuela all bought French Mirage fighters in the 1970s because the US refused to sell them the F-5, a fighter designed in the United States specifically for developing countries. Peru also bought Soviet tanks, helicopters, and other aircraft in the 1970s for similar reasons. And in fact, as late as the 1990s, Peru bought MiGs from Belarus. While there is no question that Venezuela today wants to buy more weapon systems than it needs, and that some of these systems can be used if offensively, the fact is that Latin American countries resent deeply American attempts to continue using tutelary behavior developed during the Cold War. There are, however, several 21st century security threats that affect the countries of the region as well as the United States, and the United States can help with those. These include drug trafficking, transnational crime, migration, natural disasters, and terrorism, including links with Iran, both in Venezuela and in Bolivia. The US needs to continue trying to develop close working relations with the countries of the region to deal cooperatively against these security problems. Now, while most people understand that US policies must adapt to reflect a new geopolitical situation and the needs of the Western Hemisphere, acceptance does not deter them from worrying about current developments in regional relationships. This is inevitable. As Latin America further embraces the world and becomes a player with a stake in world affairs, the circumstances will not always develop in a manner perfectly suited to US interests. After all, the United States spent decades during the Cold War actively ensuring that its backyard was favorable to its policies. Disengagement naturally ensured that the region would become less closely tied to the United States. Yet, many in Washington, as I've said earlier, continue to express this lingering concern about the loss of influence in Latin America. We have lost interest, no question about that, but that's not negative. It is rather an indication that because of globalization, the governments of the region are looking beyond the Western Hemisphere to participate in a global economic system. Globalization encourages diversification of trade and global interdependence, thus strengthening the self-confidence of countries in the hemisphere and reducing their dependence on the United States. Another way in which Latin America is showing its increased global orientation is by strengthening its relations with China. Brazil's Petrobras has an office in Beijing, and Brazil's Embraer airplane manufacturer has a joint venture in Harbin. Two-way trade between China and Latin America has grown from $200 million a year in 1975 to $102 billion a year in 2007. That's in both directions. Overall, China has a surplus with the region, but the pattern differs from country to country. For those countries such as Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Peru, Uruguay, and Venezuela, with raw materials such as copper, iron, other minerals, petroleum, and commodities such as wheat, soy, and fish meal, China seems to be an insatiable consumer. But the United States should not fear being displaced by China as the major economic player in the region. Latin America is not yet a significant trading partner for China. In 2007, for example, only 5.3% of Chinese imports came from this region. Increased Sino-Latin American trade affects different parts of Latin America differently. Commodity-producing countries benefit from the rise of their export prices. On the other hand, direct competitors of China, such as Mexico, have been adversely affected, especially in such sectors as machinery, transport equipment, and manufactured goods. Countries producing apparel and footwear are also facing increasing competition. Thus, though the economic ties between China and Latin America have strengthened in recent years, U.S.-Latin American economic relations, reinforced by historical partnerships, are still very strong. For example, in 2006, U.S. exports to Latin America were $220 billion. That is almost 4 times greater than the $55 billion that the U.S. exported to China. When President Hu Jintao traveled through Latin America in 2004, he awakened expectations in the Southern Cone that Chinese investment could reach $100 billion in 10 years. Chinese investment figures, as you may know, are hard to assess because they include revolving lines of credit. As of 2007, however, Chinese investment in the region may be somewhere between $5 and $10 billion, maybe. Disappointment in Argentina and Brazil that thought the big bucks were coming in has been intense. However, China has made some investments, not dramatic, in Venezuela, Ecuador, and even in Uruguay. Not only that, but they've expressed an interest in establishing car maquiladoras in Mexico for the day that they begin producing the new China Worldmobile. Furthermore, because of the uncertainty of Sino-Latin American relationships, China is unable, or unlikely rather, to challenge the United States directly in this hemisphere in the near future. Both China and the United States place higher priorities on other issues. The U.S.-Sino relationship is complex and includes sensitive regional issues such as Taiwan, Northern Asia, nuclear non-proliferation, pandemics, North Korea, Europe's interest in selling arms to China, and cooperation in the war on terrorism. The biggest single challenge to the United States in the hemisphere is, of course, Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez. He misses no opportunity to lambaste the United States with anti-US rhetoric. For some in Latin America, Chavez is a David bulked up on hydrocarbons, slinging taunts as the US Goliath. However, as with China, the United States should not approach the Venezuelan challenge with fear or alarm. The United States should not expect either, I might add, the Latin American countries to defend the United States or its policies against Chavez, not because they agree with Chavez, but because Chavez has offered cooperation, and he's offered to build in so many countries. In addition to subsidized petroleum, which he is now selling in the Caribbean and particularly in Cuba, he gives subsidized petroleum to Cuba to the tune of $1 billion a year. He has offered to build pipelines for oil and gas to Argentina, to Colombia, and Central America. Even if only a few of these what he likes to call his Bolivarian projects actually take place, they can make a positive contribution to energy cooperation in Latin America. Venezuela's influence and the willingness of Latin American nations to work with it despite US disapproval is another symptom of the region's increasing independence. The point I'm trying to make is this: Chavez, for all of his clumsiness, for all of his hubris and personality cult, is somebody who is making the countries of Latin America think more concretely about cooperating among themselves, not looking for forces outside of the region, but rather working together. And this is a very important development. And even though, Chavez will pass into history as a big failure, in that sense, he will have done a great deal for Latin American cooperation, particularly in economics. The United States, when dealing with Venezuela, should bear the following in mind. Venezuela is an undiversified economy dependent on one commodity. Economies that depend on one or few commodities make little effort to undertake economic reform. They breed corruption, they are usually unstable, and they tend to grow slower than diversified economies. While nobody in the hemisphere should be complacent about Chavez, we should also remember he has raised high expectations in Venezuela that he simply will not be able to satisfy. Both China and Chavez strike fear and anxiety in many US policymakers. The United States is familiar with strong influences from outside the hemisphere and stridently anti-US opinion from within the hemisphere. Yet China is not another Soviet Union. And Chavez, although he aspires to be, is not another Fidel. Part of the reason is that geopolitics in the entire world as a whole has morphed from the Cold War era of confrontation to post-Cold War engagement. As a result, even if Chavez and China wished to emulate Fidel Castro and the Soviet Union, they would have trouble doing so. And finally, keeping in mind that US interests in the region have changed, Americans should realize that China and Chavez present fewer obstacles to the US's current goals than the USSR and Castro presented to Cold War goals of defeating communism. Now, what do countries in the region need? Travel anywhere in Latin America and people will tell you they want three things. They want jobs, they want to reduce poverty, and they are bothered by crime. Those are the three. Wherever you travel, every country in the region is beset by those. You dig a little deeper, talk to local experts, and they all agree that Latin America needs help with globalization, specifically competitiveness. The region needs to diversify its exports beyond commodities to include more value-added exports. They also need to diversify their trade partners so that economic downturns in a major trading partner does not affect them as much as it has in the past. For most countries in the region, the US is still the single most important export destination. The exceptions are Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Paraguay, and Uruguay. Now, let me tell you something about Chile. We signed a free trade agreement with Chile in 2004, and it's been going like gangbusters, a huge success. But in 2006, Chile also signed a free trade agreement with China. This is the first country in the Western Hemisphere to have a free trade agreement with China. Let me tell you the difference. Chile has 15 million people. China has 1.3 billion. Now, that takes a great deal of self-confidence in your economic model. In 2006, as I said, Chile signed with China. By 2007, China was already Chile's #1 export destination. And in 2007, Peru's trade with China almost overtook its trade with the United States. A key question for leaders in the region is whether Chinese manufacturers will undersell local products and whether the high price of commodities will condemn the region to continue to be a supplier of raw materials as it has been since colonial times. The answers to both of these questions depend on political leadership in the region, but the United States can help. It's important, I think, to stress over and over that the United States should promote globalization. It's globalization, not the Cold War, that has been the dominant force for change in the world in the past 50 years. Globalization is a somewhat frightening concept, but it is here to stay, regardless of whether certain governments oppose it. Globalization, like a force of nature, can sweep aside antiquated and dysfunctional customs, institutions, and ways of thinking. It is not something that can be stopped by a leader or by a nation without incurring unacceptable costs. Globalization may be a force, but if shaped and directed, it need not be a blind force. And while globalization brings problems, without a doubt, as it has to the United States, it can also bring extraordinary benefits to people and nations, such as ideas, reforms, goods, jobs, and investments. In fact, it has altered our relationship with Latin America more than most Americans understand. Since World War II, the United States has led the world in opening markets. World trade has expanded enormously, and standards of living have risen across the globe. David Dollar, an appropriately named World Bank economist, calculates that globalization has raised 375 million people out of extreme poverty over the past 20 years. Trade, once an exotic appetizer, is now the main course in promoting growth. Many American analysts readily confess their disappointment with how little Latin America has done to meet these challenges as compared to the other parts of the world. Some suggest new U.S. economic initiatives to persuade regional leaders to focus on the issues that foster investment and growth and reduce poverty. The U.S. should, I agree, design programs to help middle-income countries in Latin America become more competitive. But this assistance should be offered only after the leaders, on their own, have adopted reforms that contribute to competitiveness. Competitiveness is a very wide concept. It can be increased through education, strengthening the rule of law and the administration of justice, deregulation, re-regulation, improving infrastructure, institution building, ensuring property rights and sanctity of contracts, equitable taxation, and reducing tax evasion. The range of reforms that strengthen competitiveness offers wide scope to any donor country or international financial organization willing to provide capacity building or economic aid. In December 2007, in a welcome display of bipartisanship, the administration and Democrats in Congress approved the free trade agreement with Peru. This bipartisanship should continue in 2008. The Congress should approve the free trade agreements with Colombia and Panama. If these agreements are not approved by the United States, the U.S. will have let down two Democratic allies, made the case for those in Latin America who argue that the United States has turned its back on the region, and abandoned a strategic pillar of our support for democracy. Open markets spread wealth and support democratic government. Opening markets for our exports has been a key objective for America even before we became independent. And today, exports are the most vibrant sector of our economy and continue to fuel our economic growth. But there is even more that we can do. We should seek to harmonize all our free trade agreements in the hemisphere, both the regional, like NAFTA, and the DR-CAFTA, and the bilateral, in order to create larger markets and more jobs, simplify the rules of trade in the hemisphere, and attract more investment. This, in turn, will move us toward an eventual hemispheric free trade association and strengthen the region's ability and confidence to compete in a globalized world. Reducing poverty in the region should be a priority not only for those countries, but also for the United States. Latin America has the highest wealth inequality of the world's regions. 13 million people in Latin America have escaped poverty in 2004 and 2005, but 200 million people still remain mired there, living on as little as $1 or $2 US a day. The most unequal countries are Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico, and they should all do more to balance growth with wealth redistribution. Now, there is also, in closing, some unfinished business for the United States. Since 2000, President George W. Bush has negotiated free trade agreements with 10 countries in the region and increased US economic assistance on a global basis. In Latin America, the administration has concentrated on anti-drug and counterterrorism programs for Colombia. One very important program entered into by this administration is the Millennium Challenge Corporation, the MCC. It has been hailed in Congress as extremely innovative. It's designed to reduce poverty and to reward good governance in the world's poorest countries by providing incentives to enact major political and economic reforms. It also requires accountability to prevent backsliding. Unfortunately, despite all the praise in Congress, this program has never been fully funded. At the present time, the Millennium Challenge Corporation has $5.5 billion in grants. It has asked for several times that amount. In fiscal year 2008, for example, Congress approved only $1.54 billion for investment, while the administration asked for $3 billion. And of course, as I said, this is a program designed only for the poorest countries, so it's only Central America, Honduras, Nicaragua, and El Salvador that are beneficiaries. There is another extremely pressing problem for the US and the region. In 1992, President George Herbert Walker Bush agreed with the presidents of Mexico and the Andean region that the US would cooperate with those governments to reduce drug trafficking based on the principle of shared responsibility. That is, supplier countries and consumer countries would share responsibility for a problem that hurts their citizens, their societies, and their economies. Washington agreed to reduce US demand for and consumption of drugs, and the producing countries would get US help to reduce production and drug smuggling. However, 15 years later, and despite a lot of effort in the United States, this country has not reduced drug consumption and demand significantly. The problem remains a growing problem in Latin America. Since the 1990s, the harmful effects of drug trafficking have spread to many more countries, not only in this hemisphere, but also in Europe and Africa. Cocaine consumption is increasing throughout Latin America, including Mexico. Brazil is now the largest consumer of cocaine in the world, and Spain has the world's highest per capita consumption of cocaine. The judicial systems and law enforcement capacity of small democracies in Central America and the Caribbean are being overwhelmed by the corruption and crime fed by drugs smuggled through and around them to the US. All countries in the region are struggling with increased crime. The US must help them. In Brazil, for example, criminals associated with drugs are able to challenge state authority in Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro. Last August, President Lula announced a US $3.3 billion program to fight crime. If Brazil asks the US for help in combating transnational crime, the US should provide it. Mexico's President Calderon is serious about combating narco-trafficking and the crime it generates. He has repeatedly said he wants more help from the United States, and since most illegal drugs enter the United States through Mexico, we have finally responded. In October, the two governments announced the Merida Initiative, a multi-year program to combat drug trafficking, transnational crime, and terrorism in Mexico and Central America. President Bush requested an initial US $500 million for Mexico and $50 million for Central America. It's crucial that Congress fund this initiative, although I might say $50 million for all of Central America is not a serious figure. It's not going to make much of a dent, and those people really need help. Now, the administration has already presented a budget for fiscal year 2009. That budget is not going to be approved by a Congress controlled by the opposition in the midst of an election year. Instead, it will be passed by continuing resolution at the same levels as in fiscal year 2008. Only after the new president and Congress are installed next year will we see what priority the executive branch and Congress assign to Latin America. There's an old saying in Washington that says, follow the money if you want to know what Washington's priorities are. My belief is that we will see an increase in spending for Latin America in the next administration. Thanks. If there are any questions, be happy to take them.
It sounds as though there's no resentment in Latin America over the over-concentration in the Middle East. They don't in general feel like we've neglected them, or is that a country-by-country situation?
Well, yes. I mean, you know, that's a very difficult thing to argue about. For example, in 2005, we had a summit of the Americas held in Argentina. As those of you who know, because you live in Florida, we were at that time working toward the free trade area of the Americas. And a few countries simply said they were not willing or interested in that. So, you know, when you say that the United States has not paid enough attention, let's remember that one of the large priorities for the United States was something that sort of just got stuck in the mud. And you'll notice in my comments, I have not suggested reviving the free trade area of the Americas because the atmosphere is just not there. But I do think that by harmonizing the agreements in the region, we can do a lot of good for them as well as for us. Sure, you know, in Latin America, in my experience, you know, if the U.S. is giving a lot of assistance, then there is, not universally, a sense that we are paying attention. But you also have to remember that they've been making a lot of money over the last 5 years. I mean, some of those countries are quite well off. It is absolutely historic, for example, for Argentina and Brazil to have paid off their debt to the IMF and to for Brazil to be a creditor nation. So, you know, there have been some good things happening down there that had very little to do with the United States, had a lot to do with the world and what people are willing to pay for certain commodities.
A question regarding Argentina and their foreign debt. Hasn't Argentina completely renounced their foreign debt?
No, and they can't, because if they do, nobody's going to extend them credit. I mean, it's as simple as that. You know, the Argentine government has criticized the IMF. You know, Argentina, to mention the IMF is about as bad as mentioning the United States and Venezuela. I really got to stay away from that. But they want more credit. Venezuela has helped Argentina to the tune of about $4 billion worth of bonds bought to help buoy up Argentina. But now Argentina must go back to the Club of Paris and settle some of those debts. To do that, they also have to go back to the IMF, whom they dislike enormously, to establish some kind of a program. It's not going to be easy. Not easy for the presidents of Argentina, not going to be easy for the IMF. For example, I've suggested to you that the figures that Argentina is using for recording inflation are not the way they're recorded normally in other countries. This is going to be the first conflict between Argentina and the IMF. I'm confident, you know, that Argentina can do it. They've had an incredible growth rate, 8+% over the years. However, there are some problems coming up. The corruption is very great. You've got the inflation problem. And you also have the fact that President Kirchner, that is Nestor, capped energy prices in Argentina. Kept the price of gas low, kept the price of electricity low. As a result, a lot of people outfitted their cars to run on natural gas instead of gasoline. And of course, the price is really, if it weren't subsidized by taxes that the Argentine government puts on, export taxes on its exports of grain and other things, wouldn't be able to manage. Now, this is something that the new President Kirchner is going to have to deal with, and it's going to be very, very difficult. You're going to have to raise the prices of energy, and that's going to hurt. And as you know, there are conversations going on as we speak between Bolivia and Brazil and Argentina on energy problems. This is going to be the big struggle for the next 4 or 5 years. Now, as you know, Brazil has discovered huge deposits of oil and gas, the Tupi field, but it'll be several years before whatever comes out of there will have any kind of an impact at all on prices, or in fact help with the energy problems in those countries.
Yes, seeing trade, well-planned and executed trade between the United States and Latin America can help U.S.-Latin America relations. What is your opinion of the current trade embargo with Cuba? Should the United States moderate it, relax it, knowing that, let's face it, I mean, Cuba hasn't had a real revolution yet. I mean, just because Fidel has given up power doesn't mean Raul's going to give up power intentionally.
Well, look, you know, Cuba is a real problem in terms of foreign policy, because it really isn't foreign policy for us, it's internal politics. And you'll notice that even the people who would like to be candidates for the White House this year are dodging what would happen in Cuba, and that's for a very simple reason. Votes in Florida could cost them the presidency. And until that situation in Florida changes, you're not going to have any dramatic changes in the embargo. Now, that said, there are many states and many members of Congress who are urging a relaxation of the embargo to sell products, particularly food products, to Cuba. And that's going to continue. I mean, it's a lucrative market for those people, and they're raising a legitimate point. But, you know, really, we're going to have to wait for the dominance of Cuba in Florida before we get, shall we say, a deeper debate going in this country. Oh, sorry, the light. I'm caught like a deer in the light. Okay.
About 29 years ago in Venezuela, there was a real explosion in the social atmosphere, because there was a neoliberal package introduced by former President Carlos Andres Perez, and that led to the privatization of a lot of companies, and the prices of the regular day inflation was really high. Therefore, that led to people rioting in the streets and, you know, a lot of chaos. Venezuela is a very rich country, as everyone knows. What do you think that a government that, you know, a president for Venezuela should do if they have, you know, a lot of money coming from oil? What should be the approach? Should be like, because like if the government of Venezuela is to give the oil to international companies, that will lead to less money in you know, Venezuelan you know, government and social administration. What do you think should be the approach for, because Venezuela is a very different case, like from all other countries because of that. What do you think should be the approach in that case?
A new government, you mean?
I mean like how the government should act in order to expend the money, in order to administrate the money coming from petroleum.
Well, you have to have somebody else running the economy other than President Chavez. You know, President Chavez has very clear ideas about what he wants to do. He wants to expand his influence, and you're absolutely right. A lot of the money is going to other countries. $1 billion a year is going to Cuba. They have programs all over the region, and resentment is growing in Venezuela. I mean, obviously, you have to get a more serious and professional management for PDVSA. That would be very helpful. Right now, the management of PDVSA is such that you know, Venezuela is not able to produce even what they say they're producing. Look, there's a million things to be done in Venezuela, and I don't really think that while President Chavez is in office, we're going to get great relief from there. Eventually, as I say, I believe that the mistakes he's made are going to ruin that economy, and then he will be voted out of office. And then we'll see what the next administration does. But this man has really done incredible damage to the economy of Venezuela. Other things they should be doing, as I mentioned in my presentation, is diversifying the economy of Venezuela. Just relying on petroleum is not a good strategy for the future. Sir?
First of all, thank you for your very balanced and well-informed conference. There are a couple of things that you didn't mention. I would like to know your opinion. One is, how do you see the influence of the European Union, especially now with the very strong euro, and also their internal experience of becoming the European Union as it relates to Latin America in many ways, and also other industries like telecommunications, which relate with the European Union, and some people like Carlos Slim have made their fortune based on that kind of industry, which is not oil and the other areas that you mentioned.
Yeah, you may remember that in the 1990s there was a wave of privatizations through Latin America, and Spain participated very heavily in that. But of course, once the privatizations were over, Europe no longer was the leading, shall we say, investor in Latin America. You've got to understand that for the European Union, Latin America is not a very high priority. They are interested in the trade. Let me give you an example from Mexico, for example. When the NAFTA was signed with the United States, the European Union's share of the Mexican market went down something like 8 points. And that was one of the chief things that urged the European Union to enter into a free trade agreement with Mexico. They still have not regained their position from before the NAFTA, but they're doing better. In other words, there is a limit to what the European Union is going to do. Now in Latin America, people say, well, you know, gee, the European Union gives a lot of help to Spain and to Greece and to the other countries that are seeking to join the European Union to help them integrate better and to meet the economic challenges. And all of that is true. But it sort of misses the point. What the Europeans are trying to do in the European Union is a very different thing from what the Latin countries are trying to do in terms of growing their own economies. It's sort of a misplaced, it's sort of like the old story that used to run around in Latin America. It'd say, if the United States would only do a Marshall Plan, boy, would we be well off. But of course, nobody wanted to focus on the fact that the Marshall Plan was a way of financing industries that had been destroyed by the war in Germany and in Japan. They had the trained engineers, they had the experience. What they needed, the money, was to get up and going. We've never had that situation in Latin America, so the Marshall Plan would never have worked in Latin America. And also, trying to transpose what's happening in the European Union in Latin America is I think not very useful. There's always that sort of, gee, if people would only invest money. In a way, that happened when Hu Jintao visited Argentina and Brazil. I mean, if you read the press in Argentina and Brazil at that time, they were going to be rolling in dough in no time at all, $100 billion worth of investment. And in fact, very little of it came. It was the belief that you can, you have to walk before you can run. And a lot of this has to do with saying, well, maybe we don't have to do the hard pulling. We don't have to do the hard work. We don't have to set ourselves up to become competitive. Maybe somebody will come along and invest a lot of money and we won't have the hard work. But in economics, it takes time. You have to have, and here's one advantage Asia has very clearly over Latin America. In Asia, even though there are very different countries in Asia, they do have a sense of priority. You see in Asia, and I'm not going to make this an absolute rule, but it seems to me, reading about Asia, that they have long-term plans and they work at them. And not only that, there seems to be some belief in the body politic that that's a good approach. It takes a long time. You know, the economy in China has been growing at what? Almost 10% for 20 years. Long-term planning. In Latin America, you get a lot of improvisation. You know, what's the latest thing that's going to happen? Right now, I've tried to suggest that one of the issues is, do the countries of Latin America, like Argentina and Brazil and others, want to remain purveyors of commodities rather than diversifying their economies? But they're running after it. Look at the whole business with ethanol. Very good idea. It's got to be explored. But there's the belief somehow or another that this is the latest gold rush. You know, this is going to save the region. They won't have to do the hard lifting that has to be done. And unfortunately, history doesn't help them in that. There is no shortcut to that.